I can remember talking to a teenager about his uncle's funeral, how he hated the funeral, he thought it was really dishonest. I asked him about it. He said, well, the eulogy didn't present my uncle as he was. It was like they wanted to make him look like a saint. I imagine this apple cutter, where you slice up the apple and you can take the core out. And I thought about how I present God to my kids. Maybe you've been in that struggle where you've been talking about God to somebody and you wanted to make God look nice, or you wanted to take the parts of God that you think the other person would like. Love, compassion, forgiveness. But you were a little hesitant to talk about the aspects of God's wrath or the violence of the Old Testament, some of the things that you know about God, but you're not sure how they're going to like it. I wanted to talk about how the Trinity shows a unified character of God throughout the whole Bible. Sometimes the view of God is that there's this angry, wrathful, bloodthirsty, crazy, loose cannon God in the Old Testament who swallows people up in the ground who are bad, who sort of blows people away at a whim, quick-tempered, loves violence and loves battles. But by the time the New Testament of the Bible comes along, you see a nice, refined, evolved God who's turned into Jesus, this peace-loving hippie who goes around feeding people and healing people and turning the other cheek and being kind. Well, that's not quite how the Bible portrays God. It's a character. It's a character from our culture, which doesn't have a lot of education in the Old Testament and doesn't really know Jesus for who he was. The Bible, in fact, presents a clear, unified character of God from beginning to end. But in the New Testament, through Jesus, there's greater and greater revelation of how God is love and how everything that God does roots from his compassion. Listen to this from Revelation, and remember this is the words of Jesus, the rider of the white horse. From his mouth comes a sharp sword with which to strike down the nations, and he will rule them with a rod of iron. He will tread the winepress of the fury of the wrath of God, the Almighty. That's Jesus, not a peace-loving hippie, but one who can bring judgment and justice. I spent a lot more time in the New Testament than the Old. I did that not because I thought the Old Testament was no longer relevant, but because it was a lot more work. The history, the poetry, the prophecy especially, I found very inaccessible. A lot of work, really messy, talking about the lives of people and how they relate to God. No clear-cut message, compared with the New Testament, which gives me nice Greek-oriented, Western-thinking logic. It is letters of practical advice with black and white clear-cut instructions. I love the New Testament's way of portraying God. It's much easier to portray God as nice. But is nice the kind of word that we want to use with God? It might be what we want to portray God when we're thinking about our neighbors or our children. But that word probably isn't the most useful way to describe God. In fact, the word nice comes from the Oxford English definition, Middle English, in the sense stupid, or from Old French, and from Latin nices, ignorant, or from nisir, to not know. So, probably not the most useful word for describing God. Maybe kindness would be a good word, but I think it would be better if we let God describe himself. The most commonly quoted verse from the Bible, in the Bible, is from the Ten Commandments when God is describing himself. And in Exodus 34, when he again describes himself to Moses. I'll just show you a little bit of that from Mount Sinai. After you've been presented with the Ten Commandments, you get a little bit of explanation. God begins by saying, you shall have no other gods before me. And he says, you shall not bow down and worship them. And he says, the reason is because I'm a jealous God, punishing the children for the sin of the parents, for the few of those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. That's from Exodus 20. Now you'll notice that if you're reading that along with me in Exodus 20, the third and the fourth generation is a part that you would maybe read in your English Bible. And after coming across the book, God Has a Name, I was digging into the interlinear and noticing that, yes, indeed, the word generation has been added by English translators trying to make sense of a Hebrew expression or a Hebrew idiom, the 3 and the 4, which, as best as they could tell, means to the few. So really the emphasis is not that God is punishing people over generations, but that there's this thousands of generations that he shows love to, contrasted with the few who hate him. Now if you read again in Exodus 34, you get a little bit more descriptive thing between Moses and Yahweh. Yahweh descended in the cloud and stood there with him as he called upon the name of Yahweh. Then Yahweh passed by in front of him and proclaimed, Yahweh God is compassionate, gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in loving kindness and truth, maintaining love to thousands and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children and their children for the sin of the parents to the few. Again, you see this word generation added on that idiom, the 3 and the 4. And I'm choosing to use the word Yahweh rather than the capital letters L-O-R-D. As this name, God Has a Name book suggests, it's much more personal to refer to God with a name, and that's exactly what he gives to Moses. He answers him with a name rather than a title. I wouldn't call my wife ma'am, she wouldn't call me sir. It just wouldn't be personal. So I choose to read these Bible passages as well, using the original Yahweh. It was probably translated into English with L-O-R-D, simply because they didn't know the vowels or how to pronounce it. But I feel this is a more personal way to read it. When you look at the reaction of the people to how Moses has spent his time on the mountain, you see that they are trembling with fear because there's this great thunder and lightning. There's this trumpet blast which gets louder and louder, and then you see billowing smoke. And it says that the people are just terrified and ask Moses to speak to us yourself, and we will listen, but do not have God speak to us, or we will die. Moses responds, don't be afraid. God has come to prove you, so that the fear of God will be with you to keep you from sinning. He sees a purpose in this fear, or in their reverence to their fear of God. This isn't a very popular topic. You don't see it in a lot of modern churches. We don't often talk about how reverence or fear of God can be important in our relationship. But I really believe it can be. Moses says that this can keep us from sinning. God and his wrath are different from our wrath. And I think that we need to talk about wrath because it's such an unpolitically correct idea. When God talks about his anger and wrath, it's wrapped up into love. In Revelation 3:19, he says, those whom I love, I rebuke and discipline. J.R. Packer, in Knowing God, on page 151, says that God's wrath in the Bible is never the capricious, self-indulgent, irritable, morally ignoble thing that human anger so often is. It is instead a right and necessary reaction to objective moral evil. As we look at the kind of gods that we have created, if you think about the Greek gods or some of the angry gods in the Hindu religion, perhaps we desire a God in our own image, a God who flies off the handle, a God who's flippant and angry. And perhaps that's why we might project onto the God of the Bible this kind of thinking, especially for those who haven't spent a lot of time in the Bible, the characters from the media. But as we get into the character of God in the Bible, we see passages that are quite different from this, presenting God. Skye Jethani notes that with a vision of God's justice, his judgment and wrath cannot be discarded, as some newer models of Christianity are eager to do. A God without judgment is a God who isn't concerned with the evil that is harming his people and his world. And his wrath is how he purged away the injustices and the agents of disorder who seek to derail the flourishing he desires. In other words, God's judgment and wrath are rooted to his love and justice. That comes from Skyjitani's daily devotions. Skyjitani is probably most famous for the book With. Well, you might say it's fine to talk about God's love with his people and that he rebukes those he loves. But what about the lost? How could you possibly say God is loving when so many are lost? C.S. Lewis asks a better question when he asks, what are you asking God to do with those who are lost? To wipe out their past sins and at all costs to give them a fresh start, smoothing every difficulty, offering every miraculous help? But he has done so on Calvary. To forgive them? They will not be forgiven. To leave them alone? Alas, I'm afraid that is what God does. In God's love, he allows us the freedom to not follow him. He doesn't pressure us. He doesn't force us. And when we'd rather choose death than being with him, when we'd rather choose death than his love, that's exactly the wish that he grants us. Sad as that is, the Bible shows an overwhelming focus on God's compassion. And probably the most important definition for us is, what is love, or what is compassion? As we view it, we might say it's whatever a person wants, or whatever makes a person happy. But as God defines this, there's a much fuller definition to this word love. He is the author of love. And in his definition of love, there's the kind of parental love that cares more for a person than would let them just be happy doing something that is hurting other people or hurting themselves, but that wants to see the best in another person. A love that truly cares for another person won't just leave them how they are. That's probably hard and difficult for us in our culture. As we read the Bible, we see this compassion beginning to end, though, that the Trinity has not changed character in God the Father and Jesus, but all the way through we see this compassion. Listen to Micah 7, where it says, "Who is a God like you who pardons sin and forgives the transgressions of the remnant of his inheritance? You do not stay angry forever, but delight to show mercy. You will again have compassion on us. You will tread our sins underfoot and hurl all our iniquities into the depths of the sea. For Yahweh, your God, is a merciful God. He will not abandon or destroy you or forget the covenant with your ancestors, which he confirmed to them by oath," we read in Deuteronomy 4. We see this emphasis on compassion. As we think about, well, how can we apply the fear of God? Yes, we can understand the compassion of God, but how can this fear of God be helpful to us in keeping us from sinning? As I think about what Jesus said when he said, "You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again?" I think that so often we are against the flow in our culture. Our culture is floating a river in one direction, and we're trying to paddle it the opposite direction. And the very most natural thing would just to go with this flow. If we're going to hold on to a biblical view of God, though, a consistent God of the Trinity, rather than buying this culture's media's character of God, it's going to require a lot of us. And it's going to be a lot harder if we try to do that alone. So much of the Christianity I inherited was this personal righteousness that we're supposed to attain to read the Bible, to be pious. Yet as I read the Old Testament, I see that it's a communal idea, which is often at the core of this. That sin isn't something that just happens inside us, it's something that happens in relationship. That these 10 commandments are described to preserve relationships with God and relationships with other people. They're not done to improve the inner person individually somehow. And as I try to get out of that individual thinking and thinking about the community, I recognize that God understood how we're made up. He understood how we are such cultural people, that we follow, like copycats, our culture. When they're into fads and fashion, we go along with it. So he built a culture for his set-apart people, a culture of feasts, of celebrations, of parties, of yearly holidays. Not only the weekly holiday where you would take a day off work, But 7 times in a year, you would have these celebrations, these feasts. 3 of them, you would make a trip all the way to Jerusalem to offer your sacrifices, to go and celebrate with others, to worship God. And these were beautiful times. And 2 out of these 3 gatherings in Jerusalem, there were barbecues, because you would make an offering, and this wasn't just consumed as it was in the Day of Atonement, but it was an offering that you would be able to eat and share. And these were for the priests as well. And in these beautiful times of celebration with the other people of your culture, it was kind of a Thanksgiving. These fall on the barley harvest, and on the wheat harvest, and on the olive and grape harvest in the fall. That's when these celebrations happen. So like our holidays, they would happen in times of harvest and Thanksgiving. It's kind of like having 3 Thanksgivings a year. 3 times to remember all that God had done for this people, all that He'd provided for them. And you would also have a week off in these times too. So it's a time of intentional holiday. Probably some of the first holiday of the ancient world was instituted by God as command in the Bible, so that not just the rich could take some time off to remember what life was really about. As we think about what life is really about, not just what the culture is telling us, but following what the biblical view of God's idea is for us. I like to think of us rowing together upstream, not trying to do that journey upriver on our own, where we'll get tired and start to drift back, but doing it in a team where we can spot each other off and spur each other on and encourage each other. And part of that looks like what a small group Bible study is. A chance to pray for each other, a chance to care for each other, and a chance to remind each other of the character of God who we follow in the stories of history, in the poetry, in the prophecy, in the letters, in the stories about Jesus. As we gather together, I think there's a time for us to be encouraged. And I think that we need that, so that we don't just get carried away by this culture's idea of this angry God, this maybe default value that we have, where we imagine a God who's just like us. I think it's time for us to throw away this this apple cutter way of looking at God, where we just show the nice parts of Him, or try to fit in our God into the culture in a way that makes Him socially acceptable or politically correct or nice. And we need to get away from the angry God too, which might be more coming from us than it ever came from the Bible. I think this is originating from us, and you see it in so many religions, and it isn't originating from a good reading of the Bible. And I think instead we can turn to the Trinity, seeing the character of God maintained, unified in the Bible between the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. A character that's defined by compassion, mercy, patience, and justice. The Old Testament is full of justice being part of righteousness, and that the true love won't ignore the least. The true love won't ignore the fighting between, but will attempt to reconcile and will attempt to heal those things and to bring unity. That is the God that I'm seeing in the Old Testament. Not a caricature, but a God defined by compassion. Thanks for listening. My name is Jeremy. I'm an associate pastor at Central Evangelical Free Church in the Comox Valley. Take care.